Well, thanks, Martin. Really glad to be here, and thank you, all of you, to show up on such a beautiful day and show your support for renewable energy. I've been at this, I guess I started in the middle 70s, and I was working with an environmental engineering company. My background's in architecture. And ended up, my old professor at the university said, hey, we're starting this program at the university. We need somebody to run it. So they recruited me, and it was a solar research and energy conservation office. And so I ran that for about 6 years. And I was on a Zoom today with a research company, and they were talking about how they were doing really well till about 1980 when the administration changed and they lost all their funds, and that's exactly what happened to me in the early 80s. But then went back to the engineering company and did a lot of energy conservation and particularly abatement projects for environmental cleanup, which was really rewarding. I also have a strong IT background because of my experience with the Navy, which was great, and so I've ended up doing IT work and with Sun and Sun Microsystems and Oracle. Did a lot of energy-related work, a lot of big projects for utilities and so on. And then eventually retired about 15 years ago, and I decided to say, hey, I'm going to start volunteering again in this area. So I've been volunteering for CRESS for about 15 years. And then ended up like I said, helping out CRESS and volunteering for American Solar Energy Society. I serve on the board of the International Solar Energy Society. I'm an advisor up at the Solar Energy International here up in Peonia, and having a great time. I also serve on a couple other boards, so I volunteer a lot, way too much. And one of them is out of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and I know we'll talk about that tonight. But we do a lot of work in China, going back and forth about 15 years. In energy transition from this is Wyoming, obviously, so the coal industry is declining, and you'll find out about that same way in the future for China. Okay, one of the ladies that I've been a big fan of hers, I've had her speak at different places, is Barbara Fenimore, and she wrote a book about in 2018 about will China save the planet? And before I start, was anybody here last week for the heat pump program? Great. Yeah, this is my heat pump installation at my home. I had to throw it in, and the gentleman that spoke last week actually helped me with some of the electronics and controls. And so there you see my 2 meters for the solar system, what I use and what I supply to what the solar system produces and what I supply to Excel, and some other, and the inverter and so on. So I just had to throw that in. Okay, yeah, I really have drank the Kool-Aid. Heat pump water heater, heat pump air conditioning, heating, solar system, electric car, you name it. I'm just about that far from getting rid of my gas connection, trying to find a good cooking induction system to replace the one I have. Okay, Barbara Fenimore. Yeah, she spent 4 decades at least in China, and she founded the National Resource Defense Council China program at that time. And actually, she was inspired to do this by the founder of the Jackson Hole group that I was talking about. So it's all connected, and they're doing a tremendous amount of work in China to help them with the energy transition. Any presentation on renewable energy and the world climate has to have the Keeling curve, sorry. And as you can see, it continues to go up. As of yesterday, it was at 427. It's kind of a seasonal high. It'll probably come back down here hopefully in a few weeks, but this was actually as of June 5th yesterday. And long story, thanks to my Navy and spent time in Hawaii back in about 97, I actually snowboarded with my son on the top of Mount Mauna Loa. So it was an unusual 5 or 6 inch dump of snow. So we got a little bit of history here. That what you saw there was a standard graph, but this shows how much the annual carbon dioxide varies so much at that laboratory. It just goes up and down. It's very, very, very irregular. Going back to the first data that the Keeling group started to go back to 59, you see the ppm, the CO2 parts per million in the atmosphere in 1959 was around 96, around 1, bounced up and down there through that decade of the 60s. Hung around about 1, but now we're in 2014, another decade through 2023, and you can see all of a sudden it's 2s and 2.5 and so on. It's increased significantly, and it keeps going up. It dropped in 2022 because of the COVID decline, worldwide, a lot less energy used, a lot less CO2 in the atmosphere. In 2023, it recovered, because the economy recovered, and then the high number, the 2084 the 2.84 ppm is forecast for the rest of the year. And you probably saw the headlines where it was 4.7 here in March. I mean, way up over the 2.82. And they feel that's because of the El Nino effect in the Pacific Ocean, et cetera. But what we're really concerned about is right now, if it's say at 425 and it's going up 2.5, it's in 10 years it'll be at 450. In 20 years it'll be 475. It's 30 years it'll be 500. And a lot of authorities say, hey, that's the curve we're on. And we think the weather is bad now and so on. Well, wait till it gets up to around 450, 475, 500. In the last 5 years, I've had over $110,000 of damages from hail to my house in 2 big hailstorms. My insurance has gone up 50%, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure you all have stories like that, but we're just heading into that. Okay, gloom and doom there. NOAA says, not just CO2, but we also have to think about methane and nitrous oxide, and those numbers are going up right along with CO2. So that affects, obviously, the temperature. And so March of this year was the 10th month in a row to be the hottest on record. And so I looked up the data for May, and it is also, now it's the 12th highest month in a row here just last month. So it just keeps going. And this is a kind of a fun way, it shouldn't be a fun way, but a really powerful way of looking at this in terms of the the air temperature anomalies. You can see how high it was last year, 2023, and then now heading into 2024. It's even higher. And like I mentioned, May was, we're now in May, it was the 12th hottest month in a row. So, and then of course the global temperature, global warming. The temperature of the oceans are increasing significantly. I had to look up what a zettajoule was. It's 360 followed by 21 zeros, so I had to type that up. But that is a huge amount of energy. And again, the daily surface temperature of the oceans are going up dramatically. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the tipping point. It gets to a certain point, and then it just keeps going right on up. One of the advantages of my various volunteers is to be able to travel with these organizations. I've been able to go to the Conference of Parties, Paris Agreement, 3 times recently, and the theme there constantly is that when the oceans die, we all die. I mean, there's some really serious people looking at that issue. Okay, so let's go back to CO2 emissions global. World, we're up there around 35 billion tons per year. Most of that is fossil fuels, as I'm sure most of you know. Land use does account for about 10-15% of that. And I like to look at 3 different ways of looking at the data. One is data gets reported by country by the IPCC, and then there's consumer-based consumptions of, in other words, it's the embedded amount of CO2 of stuff we use all the time, but it's not counted in that total of emissions. And then what I really like the best, though, is the population per capita, because that gives us a feel for what's going on. The consumption-based emissions is really kind of like your personal footprint, if you want to think of it along that line. In other words, it's the carbon, it's all that stuff you use on a regular basis, rather than some factory or whatever. Okay, and then looking at the world again. Of course, China is the big bad boy, right? And then, but the United States, we're not too far behind. The European Union is doing its share. Those 27 countries, and then the rest of Europe, it does a significant amount. And India does its share. Of course, a lot of this is the data, the CO2 emissions. We have to remember it's dominated by industrial production, GDP per capita, which is really consumption of goods and services, and population, the amount of population. China is a huge country, of course. It's 4 times bigger than we are as far as population, and India is right in there also. So they have, huge amount of population, and of course they consume it. So here's per country. Of course, China emissions per country, like I mentioned, is again the big bad boy. We're not too far behind as far as total emissions per country. China on per capita, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. I'll just wait till we talk about that. But Australia, of course, Russia has really high emissions, and these are really big countries, India and so on. So per country, they put out a lot of emissions. And there it is on a graph form. China, United States, we put out about half as much on a per country basis as China. We're definitely up there, number 2 in the world. India, again, population, and then there's the other countries on a per country basis. So per capita. All right, well, here we are on a per capita basis. United States, we're the big bad boy, and Russia and Australia, even though Australia has a huge solar and renewable energy program, on a per capita basis, they have a lot of coal, and they put out a lot of CO2. And of course, some of the Middle East countries, Saudi Arabia, et cetera, put out a lot of emissions per capita. And a lot of this is obviously, or most of it is the economic consumption of all our goods and services. And then here's another way to look at that on a per capita basis on a chart. United States and Canada, here we are. We're the highest consumption per capita of CO2 emissions. We're the big bad boys. South Korea is where we buy so many goods and services from South Korea, all the electronics. How many people have a Samsung phone or TV or whatever? They use a lot of, and South Korea is like the 10th largest economy in the world. They're even though they only have 50 million people, they produce a lot of goods that we use. And interestingly enough, their exports, China is their biggest customer for exports, not the United States, and it's growing a lot faster. So they're good friends with China. Japan is really high. We're looking at industrial developed countries here, and China is right in there. Again, about half of the United States, European Union, etc. And India is significant because huge amount of population, about the same as China, but they're as a country they're not as economically developed, and they don't use a lot of CO2 per capita. So that would look at coal. We got to get into coal in China, of course. So there's Taiwan, where we get most all of our computer chips from Taiwan. Look at that, per capita generation of coal electricity. Wow, Taiwan's the leader. And then what do we have there? China, and again, South Korea right up there, and then other countries, Japan, United States. We're down there a ways, good. and the other countries as far as per capita generation of coal electricity. I think we get about, if I remember right, about 20% of our electricity from coal and about 40% from natural gas. So here we are. We're the world's leader in natural gas as far as per capita electrical generation. We're way up there. And also, I think most of you might know, is the United States is by far the largest producer of oil and natural gas in the world. And we export a lot of that. And so that what we export does not count toward our country numbers, right? It's burned somewhere else. That's called externalities. They're exporting the problem elsewhere. So just going through a lot of numbers here and a lot of information, but it's really interesting to see the difference. And the other significant numbers is way down at the bottom. China and India per capita electrical generation from natural gas is really low. They just don't have natural gas like we do in so many of the other countries. Okay, and then the other thing is, I had to throw this in since we work so much in developing countries, is share of population with access to electricity. When traveling around with China, there's so many villages where they don't hardly have electricity at all. We were with one village and they were supposed to have 2 hours of electricity that night, but it didn't work. And across the valley was just like 100 wind machines going. Well, how about we get the electricity of those wind machines over here to this village? But when it's important to know that share of population with access to electricity, what that means is having access to electricity is defined in international statistics as having an electricity source that can provide very basic lighting and charge a phone or power a radio 4 hours a day. All right, and then you look down here at sub-Saharan Africa. Maybe what 50% of people in Africa have access to any kind of decent electricity. And of course, Africa is growing like crazy in population. One number I saw said that Africa will account for at least 50% of the world population growth in the next 20 to 30 years. 50% of the world population growth will be in Africa. So anyway, that number is going to change dramatically. Okay, global coal production. There we go. See if I can look at the little blue lines here. Obviously, the light blue one at the bottom is China. Then we have India, United States, Australia, and Indonesia, Russia, and the rest of the world in that order. So again, China's the big coal production country. And India is number 2, and United States is in there number 3, but except for the big chunk at the top, which is the rest of the world. China, coal production ramp up like crazy. In 20,000, they produced over 2,000 terawatt hours of coal. By 2013 is 22,000. So the total in 2023 was about 4.6 billion metric tons. And you see by the chart there, China is way above anybody else in terms of coal production. India and Germany are in there. And we're just below India in terms of coal production. Of course, it's dropping off rapidly. And the last year or so, the coal production in China has really ramped up because of the economic recovery from COVID. All right, again, it reached a high in 2023. Increased power demand from COVID recovery, energy security. They obviously want to secure energy for their huge industrial and population growth. But also China has imported a huge amount of coal. Before we were talking about how much they produce within the country, but now also they do a huge amount of imports. Okay, and we have newly operating coal plants in China. I think most of you heard China is building a new coal plant once a week or whatever the number is. I think that's a little bit exaggerated, but but they added a significant amount, 50 gigawatts, which is a really big number of coal-fired electrical production. There's a comment there. It says it's about the same as the installed capacity of Indonesia, Germany, or Japan. And it only retired 4 gigawatts. So so anyway, they're building coal plants like crazy. But how are they building them? The actual runtime, or it's called capacity factor, how often do they run, has started to level off, and it's going to decline dramatically and be used more and more as backup for their solar and wind, etc. These are projections by a couple different international companies or countries, think tanks that look at this very, very closely. So yes, on one hand, they are building a lot of coal plants, but you also have to remember China. Long story, but I actually happened to have a dinner with one of the Chinese ambassadors. It was really a big deal. I didn't even know what to say. But anyway, ended up talking about China and how they've raised 700 million people from basically dirt poor farming to middle class. 700 million people. That's twice the population of the United States. They've done that over the last, say, 20 to 30 years. That's just a huge production. I do a little work with the architecture graduate program down here in Denver, and I tell them, okay, green space, right? Greenfield. Build this I want this new community of 3.5, 4 million people, kind of similar to Denver size in that range, and go through all that. And they break into teams. They say, okay, we're going to build roads and hospitals and all everything to support a city of several million people. And then finally they say, well, about the budget? Oh, don't worry about the budget, I said, and then finally they say, well, what is our timeline? Okay, from greenfield, having everything built in the Denver area, 3 to 4 weeks. What? But that is the rate that China urbanize their people, build capacities like that for 2 or 3 million people once a month. That's phenomenal. The numbers are just phenomenal. So anyway, this ambassador really filled my head full of those numbers, and they've just done a phenomenal job of helping their people. Of course, it comes at a cost. Okay, the Energy Foundation of China, I mentioned our work with China, and the work we've been doing there over the last about 15 years, almost 20 years, is through the National Committee on United States-China Relations. And those are the people that did the ping-pong diplomacy, what we all saw. What's that movie? I'm sorry? Forrest Gump and all that. Okay. So anyway, they have the outfit we work with. That part of their organization is the China-U.S. relations, but they have like 200 offices all around the world doing diplomacy, and it's people to people pretty much. Okay, the other group we work with there is the Energy Foundation China, and okay, think Governor Ritter. No, I'll get around to that. Okay, but this was a photograph, unfortunately, or fortunately, I'm not in it, but the start of the what I mentioned. They funded myself and 3 other guys to come and present at their pavilion at the Paris Agreement in Dubai last December. And as I mentioned, the EFC, the Energy Foundation China, is closely aligned with the U.S. Energy Foundation. And Governor Ritter was the past chair of the foundation of the U.S. Energy Foundation. He knows this people is closely related. They share offices. They all know each other. They work with each other. And so several of them come up and said, hey, how's Governor Ritter? I said, okay, well, he's doing great. All right, so he invited 4 of us to come and present, a guy from Wyoming, 2 people from Wyoming, sorry, a guy from West Virginia, and he had interesting stories about the senator from West Virginia. And then I represented Colorado. So it was right. This was like 2 or 3 weeks after the big meeting between Xi and our president to sign the accord for the. It's called the China Sunnylands Accord. It had just been signed, and reaffirming the United States and China commitment to work jointly together on climate issues. So that was a big deal. Now, the Energy Foundation in China, they sponsor all kinds of programs. They sponsor us. But the big deal is they put out hundreds of these white papers on a wide variety of topics. And RMI, I know, has done a bunch of work through them around on travel and transportation and so on. But anyway, you can go on their website and download it says the original is in Chinese, but Google does a really nice job of translating. So if you really want to get into China, what they're doing, these are really, really good reports. And one in particular, one of the things we do with them it's called the U.S.-China Dialogue, discussing how to do just transition, training for workers, that type of thing. Obviously, that's a big thing in Wyoming, and been working with those people up there for about 15 years. And this was one of their. This is a screen capture from from the presentation we did a joint presentation we did with them about a month ago. And according to their numbers, they're predicting that they did I don't know if you noticed that one chart, there was a big drop in about 2015, and Chinese economy recovered. So they did a 5-year plan and reorganized. Okay. But the amount of people actually employed in coal plants dropped from 4.4 million in 2015 to 2.7 million in 2020. That gives you an idea how they revamped and reorganized. And numbers continue to drop. And they say by 2050 or 2060 it's going to be $1 million or $1 million less. And actually this report is available through that Energy Foundation China worksite. And it was done by the Journal of China Coal Society, which is the publication arm for the China Industry Organization. Of course, every industry has an organization. It's the China Industry Organization. And they do this journal, just like the International Solar Energy Society I mentioned. We put out their solar journal since about 1954. It's like the leading research, and I'm not involved with that part of it. I don't do that part of it, but I help them on other things. Okay. All right. So share of electricity production from solar. How are we doing for time here? All right. I need to keep moving. So you notice that in one of the other slides I pointed out that Australia has a really high coal generation, okay, but they also have a very high electricity production from solar, okay. They don't have much natural gas to speak of, or wind systems they've developed. So you see a lot of these countries like, wait a minute, how can they have such a high production of solar and then also a high production of coal? But it's just their economy and how they work. Okay. China's solar and wind ramp up, it's just been absolutely amazing. You see these charts just go up like crazy. In 2020, China came out with their goal as far as 2030. Well, in solar, wind, and reduction and meeting peak CO2 emissions, they beat it this year, like 6 years. They met those predictions like 6 years early. So when they get moving on something, boy, they do it. That's really interesting. Okay, so can China really save the planet? And we'll talk more about China, but they have a lot of economic and political challenges, which I'm sure most of you are aware of. They're trying to transform the world's second largest economy. That's depending on heavy industry, pollution, that type of thing, and one focused on clean energy and services and that type of thing. They built a monstrous amount, I hate to use that word, of heavy industry. And of course, they're the world's leaders in steel and all those heavy industries type products, glass, you name it. They're the leaders. So they're trying to transform their economy from that heavy industry into more consumer, clean energy services, that type of thing. Okay, share of electricity production from solar. All right, here's a Chile, and a lot of the countries are very high. Costa Rica, for example, renewable energy between water and wind and solar, they're almost 100%. But the share of electricity production from solar is not that good for a lot of countries. U.S. doesn't even show up on that chart. But here are some numbers. Cyprus, these are really high. These are industrialized countries like Cyprus and Spain and so on, and Germany. Cyprus, that's actually where we're, the International Solar Energy Society, where we're putting on our annual conference in Cyprus in August. They doing a great job there. And you see Germany around, 10%, and Japan is really good, almost 10%, Italy, etc. And then we get down more toward the bottom end of the list, where it's around 5%. And China is like 4.83% according to this report. United States about 4.78%. So you're kind of right in there as far as share of electricity production from solar. And again, Australia, boy, a big coal user, but they're 4.4%, almost as good as we are, et cetera. Okay, but then we get back to my favorite metric is per capita capacity generated from solar. Here's where we shine, ladies and gentlemen. We're one of the world's leaders on as far as per capita electric production from solar. Twice as much as China, yay, and almost 4 times as much as four times as much as the rest of the world. So we're doing a really good job in that regard as far as per capita electrical production. I'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay, but obviously China dominates the world in solar energy. They just, about 20 years ago, they decided, hey, we're going to do this. And they've been putting a ton of money into renewable energy of all types, so somewhere around $300 to $400 billion per year. Now, not to bash the IRA incentives, but that's about $350 billion over 10 years. You get the scale difference there, 350 per year versus 350 over 10 years. Okay, they're just dumping money into this like crazy. Okay, cheap labor, cheap panels, and of course there's a lot of environmental issues there, as far as a lot of pollution and so on. Okay, the amount of solar electric energy that China installed in just 1 year, 2023, 55% increase in just 1 year. They're just going absolutely crazy, gangbusters. And wind power generation jumped about 27%. China has the largest wind manufacturing in the world, etc. It's everything. It's big. Okay. Europe is really kind of not happy with it, as we are here in the United States. And one thing you may be aware of, Max Berger is a big Swiss company that produces solar systems, and they've actually stopped production on one of their plants, and then now they're looking to build this. And in fact, they've committed to build a big solar plant in Colorado Springs. And also Arizona, depends upon what part of the process they're manufacturing. So we're to take advantage of the IRA incentives, obviously. China, because of its production, its advantage is, this report said, formidable. China can produce panels somewhere around 16 to 18 cents per watt. European countries, it costs 24 to 30 cents. In the U.S., it costs about 28 cents. So that's why we need all those incentives to be able to protect jobs and so on, to bring the costs down. And then if we look at this real quick here, is that this is its capacity as far as capacity to build solar in 2021. you know, there's, well, the demand and modules and the cells, the wafers, etc. Blue here, the light blue is China, 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 China. And the expected capacity in 2027, again, China, 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 all the way through. But the actual production is China, 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 except that the China solar factories are actually operating at about 50%. So you think they can produce a huge amount now if they really cranked them up? They, you know, look out. Okay, so is China a global threat or save the planet? Politicians, they look at China moving into Latin America with all kinds of, they're investing overseas several billion dollars a year investment in all kinds of things all over the world. I think this says, yeah, $350 billion a year in 2022 that they've spent, building factories, automobiles, everything imaginable all over the world. Okay, I think you're getting a picture here that China, it really is taking over the world. But is it a threat, or are they going to save the planet? Okay, we going to take a while before we'll find out. All right. So Janet Yellen and several other high-ranking U.S. dignitaries have visited China recently, complaining about exports, Chinese exports. You know, it's really low capacity. They're talking about automobile factories in Mexico, et cetera, and getting awfully close to our borders. Okay. They through that Sunnyvale Accord that I talked about earlier, that opened up the doors to be able to go back and forth and say, okay, we need to figure out a way of doing this. And you think back about 30 or 40 years, everybody was worried about Japan imports. Think of all the Japanese cars. Well, what did we do? We worked out a system where they build the cars here in the United States, and I'm not an expert on that, but that's one way of solving that situation, although that's not really politically friendly. Okay, so big green rivalry. You know, they're just going like crazy. Tesla canceled their big expense or investment in this an inexpensive car that they were planning on build, because China is just coming out with cars that are so unbelievably nice. I've ridden in the BYD cars for the last 10 years, and they're doing really nice cars for half the price. It's more statistics, and it's not just BYD and so on. These other electronic companies, all of a sudden, are building cars $4,000 cheaper than Tesla cars, etc. And yeah, this one company claimed they had orders of 50,000 cars in the first 27 minutes since sales started. We'll see. All right. BYD, they're the biggest. In most categories, they are the biggest electric car company in the world. I think, as you probably know, Berkshire Hathaway invested in them over 10 years ago, and they're just going like crazy. Just in the last week, they announced a plug-in hybrid vehicle that has a 1,300 kilometer range, about 700 miles. And it's selling for around $14,000. How are you going to compete with that? Okay, guys, it's in some ways it's good news. Other ways, hey, it's not good news. So and then of course battery. They're the contemporary Amperex technology company. They're the biggest battery operators in the world, and then they use a lot of hydropower to create to make the batteries. Except last year and year before, they had serious problems with water supply, drought and so on, and so that really hurt them. So they, even though Tesla, and they make these batteries for Tesla, even though they could claim that, hey, it's all hydropower, zero carbon, we're making batteries for electric vehicles, that they still have to be worried about hydroelectricity. All right, another big BYD opened up a new sodium-ion battery gigafactory, huge factory, using different sodium-ion battery technology, which I am not familiar with. But it's caused a lot of excitement in that part of the world. How are we doing, Martin, for time? We got about 15 minutes. Okay. All right. I think we'll make it through. All right. So China says, hey, wait a minute. All these subsidies for electric vehicles in the United States, that's unfair. We complain about China, producing these low-cost products with government subsidies. Well, of course, we're doing the same thing. So it's interesting, they go back and forth on these issues. So the IRA distorts fair competition, seriously disrupts global new energy vehicle industry and supply chains, and violates World Trade Organization rules. All right. They have to look out for themselves, too. Okay, nuclear. People often ask, what is China doing in nuclear? They are experimenting with the small modular reactors. But the red line there is the renewables investment, and then the blue line is their non-nuclear, low carbon energy supply. So they are building some nuclear, but not nearly as much as terms of what they're investing in other renewables. And then from either a U.S. or a global viewpoint, it's far, far better to invest in renewables rather than put up with the financial impacts later on. Levelized cost of carbon abatement, that's similar to the levelized cost of energy or levelized cost of electricity that you're probably familiar with. Because it only costs $40 to $75 to avoid a ton of carbon CO2 emissions using solar and wind, where the adaptation and loss and damages and social costs of carbon are anywhere from $300 to $1,000 a ton. Kind of pick your number. But it's if you're running a business and you could avoid a cost of $1,000 by spending $75, wouldn't you do that? All right, guys. Okay, can they really save the planet? The leader of China, they're like I mentioned many times, they're just all over it. And here's a comment. They were going to achieve peak carbon dioxide emissions. In other words, that's carbon dioxide emissions in many countries going up, and then it gets to a point, and then they start going down. Well, China's goal, I mentioned that a little bit ago, was that in 2020 they pledged that they would hit peak in 2030. Well, they hit peak this year, 6 years early. And they want to do carbon neutrality by 2060. Hopefully they'll do it much sooner. So that's one benefit of all this that they are doing. And I've tried to put links to all this information, so you can take a look at that. So will China really save the planet? Certainly doing its part in the power and transmission sectors. And addressing mitigation and abatement, greenhouse gas emissions, etc., reduce the need for adaptation, loss and damages, carbon dioxide removal is another ball game. Because what we're talking about here is preventing the CO2 from getting in the atmosphere, and then adaptation, cost, loss and damages is what we're trying to do to address the issue. Okay, so can they really save the planet? Well, we're going to have to wait and see, but they're definitely doing their part as far as population growth, actually reducing population in China. Resource consumption, environmental issues, biosphere, ocean waste reduction, these are all things that we need to address. If you're familiar with the Project Drawdown, Paul Hawkins, another little bit of a story, but about 6 years ago, I was working on a project with them, and I realized that half of the solutions here are money and technology intensive. The other half of the solutions are you and I personal, food waste, a better agriculture, and so on. It's human based activities that we need to do to reduce at least half of it. That's on a global scale. And so, but how do you incentivize people to do that? On the hard, what I call hard technology, money investment, technology, business, factories, et cetera. Get investors, hey, you get excited about that. We're dumping trillions of dollars into that side of it. But how you dump $1 trillion into the guy that has a water buffalo in Cambodia, and what advantage does he really have? I would do a lot of, Cambodia is one of my favorite countries. What advantage does he have really? And so how do we incentivize people to on food waste, all those kinds of issues? So, if you take a look on the project drawdown site, they're starting to divide these things on that, and I like to think I had a little bit of input there to have them do that. All right, so we have a few more minutes. I got a couple spare slides here. So change is the only thing that you know about change. If that is true, it'll always change. Charles Darwin. This is kind of a spare slide here as far as showing what's going on globally in terms of hydro and wind and solar. They're both growing, so they're both getting real close to producing the same amount of renewable energy. Okay, and just yesterday, the Solar Energies Industry Association announced that 71% increase in solar production in the United States. So we're doing our part. California's having issues around their net metering, so that's kind of stumbling there. But let's bring it home here to well, and then Wyoming, which we're working a lot. Wyoming typically is number 50 in the nation at the bottom as far as solar production. Oh my gosh, embarrassed. Okay, but they're booming with solar. That's been a 5 or 6 year project working with them because they realize, hey, finally coming to realize. I mean, they're realizing, but politically, hey, we need to do something with solar, and they're doing a lot of wind, but it takes 15 years to build these transmission lines out to the West Coast. They can't wait around, so they're focusing on solar. So they've announced, it was called the Cosmo Project. It had to have its name. But it's finally been announced and approved. 771 megawatts of solar installation with 268 megawatts of storage. And I think that's at least a large, I think it's larger than the one down in, that Excel's building down in Pueblo. But anyway, let me go ahead and skip back to this. Okay, here we go. Challenge to Colorado, solar per person per state. That's, per person, that's my big metric, right? California, 300 watts per capita. This is 2022 data. Arizona, Rhode Island, New Jersey, et cetera, right on down the line. Pregnant pause. Where is Colorado? No, they're like 14. The Sunshine State. NREL. We need to crank it up, guys. That's a challenge here. But going back to the previous slide, with all these solar projects that we're working on in Wyoming, we'll have about 4.5 watts per capita, way ahead of California. All right. That's a huge accomplishment for the cowboy state to go down that line. But the secret is here, and I actually met with the governor about 6 years ago and presented all this stuff and utilities and so on, is, okay, Wyoming has all this huge potential and solar and wind, et cetera. Some southwest parts of Wyoming actually has better solar potential because of the cool temperature and higher elevation than Pueblo, and way south. Okay, but they have all this potential. But how are they going to use it? Well, we don't try to ship it out, consume it in the state. So most of that's in the form. This new production will go to data centers, which data centers are booming all over. And there's a lot of issues around data centers because they're using a huge amount of energy. But we're, who's demanding that service? Yeah, getting back to POGO and who's really the issue there? We just need to quit using the internet, right? Sure. Yeah, right. Okay. So the other thing that this, I always have pronounced this, the city, whatever trap. Okay, there's a huge amount of political discussion and so on, that what happens when one big powerful country and is being replaced by another big powerful country, how do we work through that without going to war, having severe conflict and severe problems? So that's what the politicians are trying to work on, and this is a great book. The University of Denver has a program down there. About once a month they do a presentation on U.S. versus China, the political issues, and South Korea, and it's free. You can, it's at the Corbell Center down there. But anyway, this is a great book talking about how do we work through that trap. So that's about it, everyone. I think that's it for me. End of slideshow. And thank you very much. I hope I didn't overload you with too much data and too much information. But if you want to get a hold of me, thank you.
Nice to see all that data. I like data. You didn't mention carbon capture and storage at all. What do you know about activity on that in China?
Okay, there's a general need for carbon removal from the atmosphere. I quoted those numbers. It gets up to 450, 500. You know, the weather and the damages are just going to be worse and worse. So how to remove that? The direct air capture technology, you know, I mean, what is there, 0.04 of carbon in the atmosphere, something like that. That is extremely hard to try to capture that on any kind of technology. There's 3 organizations, RMI here, and what are the other 2? They've done big studies on that, and it's just, they're saying that any technology is at least 5 years away. And but on the other hand, people will argue that, okay, if we don't, for every ton of carbon in the atmosphere and it stays there 30, 40 years, the damages is like $500 to $1,000 a ton. Huge damages by leaving it in there. And so if we spend similar amounts of money to remove it, you know, that's one argument. And there's no solution there. RMI and the other 2 big think tanks are kind of. But thanks for the question. It's a really hot topic. I wish I had an answer. Yeah.
So, very interesting presentation. So, you talked about China now using its coal capacity for backing up intermittent renewables. The problem with just relying on coal capacity for doing that is it has relatively slow response times compared to gas turbines and combined cycles, which China doesn't have much of because it doesn't have much natural gas. So my question to you is, on the one hand, China is going gangbusters on battery production, but how much of their domestic use of batteries goes to the power sector to complement the coal backup capacity compared to going to mobile applications?
Right. Okay, if we phrase that again, how much?
So,
say battery production, for example.
You can't back up intermittent renewables just with coal capacity because the response time is too slow. So you need something with quick response times, and you can do that with batteries for up to 6 hours of storage. And so, can you say something about what China is doing with regard to use of batteries for backing up intermittent renewables on the grid as opposed to mobile applications?
You know, I really can't. I don't have that kind of detailed information what they're doing. And one of the projects back in 1980 for Argonne National Labs was we did a review of, okay, what kind of backup storage, that type of technology. My personal favorite was flywheels. They're sitting there spinning and man, they just kick in. But for a lot of technology reasons, they haven't kicked in. Of course, batteries 40 years ago were, you know, that was kind of a dream, about like solar was. But no, I really don't know how they handle that. Sorry.
Yeah, I would like to follow up on the question of this gentleman over there. Is China talking at all about removing CO from the atmosphere? I haven't read anything about it.
Yeah, a very little. They haven't focused on that much on that. Particularly direct air capture. They've been doing a little bit, but not very much at all, from what I know.
Because we can read about at RMI and other institutions in the West, but
Yeah.
what are the Chinese doing? Because it's a critical element for them as well.
Yeah, they don't have the best record in the world for being concerned with a lot of that damages. Let's put it that way, environmental. That's kind of a cruel statement, but right now they're focused primarily on keeping their economy going and their people improving their lives. They have mentioned the improving the 700 million people. They still have about 300 million people, about equivalent to the population of the U.S. that needs, basic amenities, and they're really doing a good job addressing all the trips to China and all the people we talk to, just normal people. They're very outspoken. I've never had anybody hold back their opinions, and they'll criticize Xi. They'll just go on, but they are really satisfied. Universally, they're satisfied with what China has been doing to help people get up to a decent standard of living. That's really their priority. And in a lot of ways, you can't fault them. I mean, you take care of your people. So. And Xi is very popular. He's just really popular because of that.
You mentioned a really good book, Project Drawdown. We are trying to put together a book club meeting with environmental books. What besides Project Drawdown have you seen any books that you think are really, really good?
In addition to Project Drawdown, and what's the intent? Or just kind of a book club or something to read, or
book club spin-off from environmental? Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, go ahead, Martin.
My guess, what you're going to say is Hannah Ritchie.
Oh yeah, Hannah Ritchie.
You're almost obligated to mention her because half of your slides were from Our World in Data, which is.
I tried to put her name down there a few times, but yeah, she's an amazing writer. This Roberta Bosco. She's a person with the World Meteorological Organization, and she writes really well. It depends upon the topic. There's so many good people out there.
The book is called Not the End of the World.
Not the End of the World.
And she's the chief data scientist for Our World in Data, which is a highly regarded and often quoted organization.
Yeah, she comes out of Oxford and some of the big think tanks there in the UK. She's really good. If you can get on her LinkedIn or whatever, it's Hannah Ritchie.
So Robert, there were a couple of areas you did not talk about. One is transmission. The other is power system operations.
Oh, thank you.
And I know, during the Obama administration, there was a lot of government-to-government cooperation. I was part of a delegation from NREL to
got a story around that one
National
too, but
Grid.
go ahead, sorry.
Yeah. And it seemed to be a good exchange. I mean, they've got some incredible knowledge in transmission, DC transmission, and they were looking for advice on basically dispatch, scheduling, power system operations. You quoted the capacity that's been added. The problem is a lot of that's curtailed because coal is number one in the stack, and wind and solar have to wait until coal is happy before they can get on the grid. So the capacity factors are much lower. So all that stopped after the Obama administration. Have you seen any change? Is there any hope of kind of renewing that exchange? Because it was pretty good.
Yeah, the Sunnyvale Accord, that was really critical, and I think I mentioned a little bit that now really senior people like Ellen and so on are going back and forth in that communication line, and then like even with our work there on our very small level, all of a sudden we they invited us to paid our way to go to Dubai. Like, all right, but it's purely to increase that communication. Going back to transportation, you mentioned transmission. I'm sorry. Yeah, China has something like 80% of the ultra high voltage DC lines in the world. 80%. I forgot to throw that little statistic in, but thanks for bringing that up. But yeah, what year was that? But anyway, it was before the election when our President Trump was elected. It was in September. And to get the whole Paris Agreement thing going, they have to have enough countries sign it that account for at least 50% of the CO2 emissions. Well, of course, that means you have to have the U.S. and China sign it, right? I mean, because they're without those two. I mean, when those two sign it, then it's in effect. So we happened to be at the Low Carbon Development Forum in Shanxi, China, when that fall in September. And so they decided to do a joint signing ceremony, and everything was great. It was, we're going down the road, China and the U.S. Then, of course, 2 months later, it all went downhill. So anyway, that Sunnyvale Accord is really, really critical to try to get people to talking together. And the other major part of that Sunnyvale Accord is that to set up a military hotline and get the military leaders talking back and forth. That was the other part of that accord. But yeah, good question. Yeah. Hopefully we can, like that trap I was talking about. That we can't be enemies. They're just people. Sorry.
And one more note about the high voltage direct current transmission lines is I always thought that the Chinese were basically, it was all homegrown, but that's not the case. There were companies like ABB, a Swiss headquartered company, and Hitachi from Japan, deeply involved in developing this technology. So, and that's good to hear, because it means despite the political differences on the commercial level, there's still huge cooperation with China, regardless of what the politics say. Yep. It's a laboratory. The trouble is those people who are the pioneers, who invest huge amounts of money into renewable energy and transmission innovation, now they're getting blamed for being ahead because they have paid the price for that development. That's a little odd.
A little comment there. I was like, my brother-in-law taught social studies and so on in school. He's probably 10 years older than I am. But he was saying, when a developing countries get going like that, he said, there is a place for a dictator that says, hey, we're going to do it, and we're just going to go do it. To me, it was like, what? And he was probably as liberal as politically as you could get. But he said there is a place for a dictator in certain cases, and which I may or may not agree with. But
especially when it comes to transmission, because if you have to negotiate with every county and state to have transmission built, that's why it takes 10 years. If it succeeds, it doesn't always
17 years for Anschutz. He wanted to build that. He is building the biggest wind system in the nation up there in Wyoming. 17 years. That's just, it's not.
Actually, I'm Bernie Ruffinack. I've worked in the power biz all my life. Well, I'm retired now. But, with solar is doing great. The efficiency, of course, is now you could cover a house with solar panels and provide all the power. And if you add parking lots like around here, that helps. But you look at tall apartment buildings and office buildings downtown, there isn't enough rooftop space. So we need the solar farms out in the country. And on the transmission systems, reconductoring an existing line goes really quick. So, adding capacity to our existing system, that goes quick. The problem is that adding capacity to a power line doesn't get the power line out to where the solar or wind is. And, the people that are, really pushing for the big solar are us environmentalists. And who's fighting the power lines? It's us. The environmentalists are fighting the power lines. We want the solar and we want the wind. We're the only ones fighting the power lines. And you know, and that's the,
It's argument between, big transmission lines versus the local grid. Yeah,
Well, on that
microgrids and
note,
so on.
my big issue with society is that propaganda works so well. And there is a huge network of Facebook groups by a guy who was, I believe, originally funded by the coal industry to whip up sentiment locally in communities all over the United States against solar or wind development. They're being fed talking points that are being refined to really hit you emotionally, and they're quite effective. There's communities all over the place influenced by these tactics. So it's not just environmentalists or NIMBYs, it's also people who are being instigated by evil-minded interests who are behind those sentiments.
Yeah, a lot of it, doing a lot of marketing in my career, but being an advocate for all types of things. Number one is not to demonize whatever, but to actually go to that group, whatever it is. Maybe it's a politician, whatever. Find out what their needs are, and that's been our approach up in Wyoming. It's taken 6-8 years to really do that, but find out what their needs are and say, hey, okay, we find out what their needs are first, and then hey, we got a solution, hopefully a solution for you. But that is so important as far as advocates, being an advocate.
Great talk, really appreciated it. Question about China and their coming demographic collapse potentially with the birth rates that are falling tremendously and a population decline that's expected. And then obviously coming up and being the lion's share leader of world population growth. But do you expect this population decline and the aging workforce and everything to be a damper on their goals to get to this clean energy future?
Depends upon what country you're talking about.
China specifically.
China. I don't think so. And again, I really haven't thought about that very much. But when you have an aging workforce and a declining number of workers, they'll have to get just more and more efficient, and as the cost less, and environmental impacts are going to have to be less. And I think that's where it's going to win out long term. But at the end, the population thing, that's like I was talking about South Korea. There was one, their population is going down. In fact, one WAG said in about 250 years, there's not going to be a South Korean person left on the face of the earth. That's how bad they're going down. But they're doing really well with aging workforce and technology and energy and so on. I don't think I mentioned, but I was going around China and I kept seeing these Samsung TVs and monitors everywhere. And after a while, really hard to find a monitor or whatever in China, at least where I was, that was not Samsung. Well, wait a minute, I have Samsung in my house. I got all kinds of Samsung. I got a Samsung phone over there. But like I mentioned, China is really one of their big markets, plus their manufacturing there and back and forth. So I didn't really address your question, but it's a huge problem, particularly in the developing world. The only reason our population is kind of staying stable or growing a little bit is because of immigrants. Italy population, most of Europe population is, the birth rate is not keeping up with the or the death rate. I'm sorry, the birth rate is not keeping up with the death rate. Sorry, but it's a good question. It's no silver bullets. Sorry, but it's something we all have to think about.
Yes, thank you for all the data. I really love it. Data-intensive presentation. Appreciate that. My question is almost more Wyoming-centric than China-centric, but in simple terms, what about wind? I mean, I thought I heard you say we were talking about transmission a minute ago, and obviously that same issue applies whether it's wind or solar and getting the power to California where it's going to be used and that sort of thing. I don't know if they have those same, especially environmental concerns in China, or if they just, roll over everything. But what I didn't see in your presentation was kind of the wind side of this whole thing. How does that factor into the whole picture?
I'm a solar guy, sorry. but as far as wind in China, they I don't think I put that chart up, but definitely they're investing far more in solar than wind. Wind just takes a while, lot longer to produce, but at the same to develop and install and so on, and the transmission lines. But solar, as you know, it can be done locally in small scale. But the other hand, they're building these monstrous solar plants. But I've seen a couple of headlines recently. Is wind kind of, it's not, it is declining in terms of input compared to solar. I mean, it's still growing, but not nearly as fast as solar, because it's just too complicated. I think China's running into the same issues as far as transmission lines and development and so on. They can produce the solar panels on a kilowatt basis far cheaper, faster, that type of thing than the wind system, even though they are the largest wind manufacturer in the world by far. I don't know if that really answers your question, but yeah, that's a good topic.
Well, I'm sure you'll think of more questions when we all gather in the chapel across the hall.
And eat your good food.
To have some good food and some drinks, and most importantly, more conversations. So I thank you all for coming.